Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, I'm joined by Charles Cobb Jr., known to many of his friends and others as Charlie, Charlie Cobb, author of this nonviolent stuff will get you killed, veteran from SNCC. And we're going to talk a little bit about freedom schools, and we also have Professor Bedour Alagraa, who's going to join us and talk a little bit about the freedom school that she, Felicia Deneau, and Josh Myers have planned for this summer. And so that starts actually tomorrow, and there's a link in the show description for folks who want to check that out. Maybe you want to check it out now. Maybe you want to check it out after you hear a little bit more of this conversation today. But I'm really excited to be talking to Charlie again, and we had a conversation a few years ago now on the audio podcast side with him and Jennifer Lawson. It's one of my favorite conversations that we've had since we've done this podcast, and so I definitely encourage people to check that out as well if they have not yet, because I'm sure there's aspects of that that we won't be able to cover all of today, because we're going to have a little bit more of a focus around the freedom school aspect of SNCC. And so anyways, I'm going to go ahead and bring our guests to the stage now and get us started. So Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today. Bedour, it's great to be with you again. Good to see you both.
Hi.
Hello. So Charlie, let's start with you on this. I would love it if you would just kind of give us, my understanding is you created the original proposal from reading through the SNCC Legacy Project's information to kind of start the first freedom school for SNCC. And so could you just start with a little bit of, what you were thinking about and that program and your kind of vision for it, and then maybe a little bit about what it actually was.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to understand about the freedom schools, and it actually links to history, is that the freedom school and the idea of the freedom school was lodged into the movement that was unfolding in Mississippi, the struggle that was unfolding in Mississippi. And it wasn't just a SNCC movement. There was COFA, the Council of Federated Organization, which originally had been formed to provide support for released freedom riders who were being released from Parchment Penitentiary, and then evolved into kind of a coalition, really, of at two levels: a coalition between movement organizations, SNCC, CORE, COFA, and the like, and secondly, a coalition between local community organizations. Without elaborating, the point I want to make is that you have to understand the schools as emerging because of the movement that had emerged in Mississippi in the 1960s, of which SNCC was in fact prominently a part of, but not the sole entity within that movement. Secondly, the idea emerged really at two levels. One, as a practical matter. We were in the process of planning, with much debate, I should say, the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project, which we envisioned as bringing upwards of 1,000 students to Mississippi to work that summer, 1964, with the movement. And there was a lot of debating about, how we assumed correctly that most of those students were going to be white, and most of them were going to be Northern, and most of them were going to be totally unfamiliar with Mississippi or the Deep South. So the big question hovering over these discussions was, well, what are we going to do with them? How do we use these people in any effective and meaningful way? And that is the idea that roots the freedom schools in the movement. And somewhere in those discussions, I proposed the Freedom Schools. I don't even remember the specific circumstances. In any case, the result was me writing an actual proposal, not in an academic sense, but just proposing to SNCC, the organization with which I was working, formally proposing that we do something that I just dubbed. I don't even remember why I picked that name, Freedom Schools. And that's practical because if you're an organizer in Mississippi, and I don't think people today even understand how violent Mississippi was and much of the deep South was. It was murderously violent. So do you really want to go from one side of the county to the other with white students? How much danger are you prepared to expose yourself? Because you are exposed if you're in a car with a bunch of white students traveling from one side of the state or one side of the county to another. And Freedom Schools, as a practical matter, was a way to resolve this kind of tension that's built into that. Well, we'll keep them in communities where they would be most protected. And there's a whole story which I've written about of how communities protected civil rights workers and organizers. Secondly, and this is part of the movement roots, we were organizers in SNCC and in CORE especially, grassroots community organizers. And the one thing we knew was if you could figure out a way to tackle education even a little bit, it built support for you in the community because there was a consensus in the South just around education, just the way there was a consensus, and I'm talking about the Black South. There was consensus around education just the way there was a consensus around voter registration. If you could do it, education was a good thing. Everybody who was Black in Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama knew that these schools, and that's not, let me hasten to add, to denigrate some of the and undertold stories of the heroic effort of some teachers in segregated Black schools to actually provide an education for their students. Some of these teachers were killed for doing this. So I don't want to minimize the importance of this, but the consensus in the community, which is what an organizer is always attuned to, was that education was a good thing if you could do it. And it was easier to do the Freedom Schools because, unlike, say, voter registration, which required you going to the county courthouse, Freedom Schools were lodged inside the Black community. So the danger was less. Not that Black communities weren't under attack for lots of different reasons, but the Freedom Schools, they took place under trees, in churches, sometimes in homes. That's a lesser danger, and you could speak more freely in the Black community, inside the Black community, than you could certainly in a public school, which were designed to keep Black people to do two things. One, to keep Black people uneducated and ignorant, and secondly, to teach Black people to believe in their own inferiority. So this is what we were trying to experiment with in these. And the last part of it is, as I said, Mississippi, like much of the Black Belt South, was extremely violent. And as I said, I don't think people understand the kind of violence that existed in that state. It was extremely violent. So, and we couldn't get the country to pay attention to it. They didn't, not the federal government, certainly not state government, and certainly not local government. We couldn't get the country to pay attention to it. And there's a string of murders in our history in SNCC that unfolded in Mississippi, and not just SNCC. I'm thinking of Medgar Evers as I speak to you. So how do you get the country to pay attention to the violence which was getting in the way of people registering to vote? Well, what we decided, sort of informally, because I don't know that there was an actual explicit discussion of this, although an underlay discussion. Well, the way you do that is you bring the country's children to Mississippi. And if they're exposed to what you've been exposed to, they will pay attention in a way they never have before. Sadly, that was proven with the murders of James Chaney, Mickey Shorter, and Andy Goodman at the beginning of the 1964 Songbird. So all of this is unfolding and at play in our discussions that lead up to the Freedom School. So I say this to say there was more. It was about more than reading, writing, and arithmetic, or more than remedial education was at play in the sense of why there was freedom. One last thing, because I've gone on a little too long. One last thing to say is that although the Freedom Schools are identified with the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project, they were not a new idea. The whole history of Black people in the United States, a lot of it has to do with the struggle for education. I mean, I'm thinking of a woman named Mary McPeak, for instance, in Hampton, Virginia, free Black woman, but who secretly taught enslaved Black people to read and write during the era of slavery. That was her mission. And you can actually see a plaque to her on the Hampton University campus because the oak tree under which she taught students is still there, still alive. And it's called, I think, and I don't want to swear to it, but I believe it's called Emancipation Oak. And it's Miss McPeak, way back in the 19th century, during the era of slavery. So there's a whole history that Freedom Schools were just in the 1960s was the latest incarnation of the effort to educate Black people. So in a lot of ways, education and the idea of freedom in the Black communities have always been linked. And we were just continuing that tradition that properly belongs to the freedom. I'm thinking of Septima Clark. I'm thinking of Miles Horton of the Highlander Center. I'm thinking of Dorothy Cotton. I'm thinking of a lot of people who were older than we were, who had been out there long before some of us were even born, educating around the idea of freedom as well as ideas of literacy.
Thank you for laying all that out. I appreciate, your storytelling always, but also your grasp of the history there. Bedour, is there anything you want to add on to what Charlie has said before one of the things I do want to talk about is obviously we're in the 60th anniversary of 1964, so the Freedom Summer, and you all are doing something at the People's Forum, and it's virtual and online. We can talk about a little bit about what that is, but I don't know if you want to respond at all to Charlie's intro before we get into that.
I mean, how to respond or add anything to that? I mean, I think I'll just offer some emphasis on points that Professor Cobb has already made. I think, one thing is having combed through all the documents, working on the SNCC Legacy Project, and also working to prepare for this course. I do know actually what you wrote in the initial proposal, and I can tell you what that is. And one thing you said in the initial proposal, and I think this speaks to your emphasis, is that it was not that these Black teachers in these schools were not doing their job, right? But it was simply meant to supplement what they were already receiving in the schools from these Black teachers. And this is what you wrote. You wrote that it was to, quote, fill an intellectual and creative vacuum in the lives of young Negro Mississippians and to get them to articulate their own desires, demands, and questions, end quote, right? So you can see from this kind of preamble for the, Mississippi Freedom Schools that it is about something much larger, right, than simply, one, our political establishment, two, the kind of legal confines, perhaps around segregation or desegregation, that it was about something much broader, right? Something that would be more enduring, perhaps, than the kind of possessive material investments, which were important in, right, the establishment of a more equitable distribution, right, of political power inside of these structures. But it was something, bigger because it, like Professor Cobb said, comes from such a longer history, a history that is so long that it's to find a beginning would be like catching a cloud and like pinning it down. And it's not unrelated to, if you think of hush harbors, so many people, will think of hush harbors as places where, enslaved persons, little enclaves or like, small retreats that they would carve out inside of these plantation communities where they would gather to practice religion. But it wasn't just that. Oftentimes they were gathering to study and to read, right? And to learn together about history. Right. So more recently arrived enslaved persons, right, would give kind of oral histories about the African continent having been more recently arrived, right, and kind of transmitting important histories that they didn't entrust to, the dominant society to offer even after, quote unquote, emancipation, right. And it reminds me of what, Sylvia Wynter writes that, the enslavers, right, did not realize, right, that by banning literacy, they did not ban, right, the dissemination of knowledge because, right, the dissemination of knowledge among African descendant people has not always been contingent upon what she called the paraphernalia of literacy per se, right? But what if we also added literacy, right, to the toolkit? Now we have a possibility where we can develop and build a more comprehensive portrait of who we are as Black people, right? And as people of African descent. And I think the Freedom Schools have always been, instrumental to that. And I am just happy to be inserting myself inside of a very, very deep, long, and varied and beautiful and also complicated, right, tradition of trying to think about what education means. And like Professor Cobb said, it is, I mentioned this last week in a conversation that I had with Josh and Felicia, but one of the things that people miss in Carter G. Woodson's work is that the miseducation of the Negro child is one and the same as the miseducation of white children inside of schools, right? And white children are receiving, right, instruction in schools, and then when they leave school, they're receiving additional instruction in how to participate in a culture of domination, right? And it's being bolstered outside of the schools, and it's highly effective, right? And so we also cannot ignore, right, the possibilities, right, of, on the one hand, having Black teachers teach these children inside of these schools, and also to bolster, right, and deepen and make more sturdy, right, our own self-conception outside of school, because that's actually, right, part and fundamental to the miseducation of the Negro as well, right, is that dual process that's happening inside of a culture of domination in white society. And so those are my very few points that I'll add to that part.
No, that's great. I mean, do you want to give a little bit of a, I'm interested in kind of the topic and the themes that you're covering too this summer, and like how you all sort of arrived upon that, and what you hope to help unearth in the project that you're going to do this summer, at, the SNCC Legacy Project at People's Forum.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by sharing how I got involved with this project. So, I mean, it's interesting. My first encounter with Professor Cobb was back in 2014. And it was when the SNCC Legacy Project was recording part of their critical oral history series at Brown University, and the Department of Africana Studies was hosting and helping to pay for a portion of it. And so at the time, I was Anthony Bogue's third week of graduate school, fresh, just had arrived from Toronto. And a few of us had been singled out and voluntold to make ourselves available. He canceled classes, that week. He was like, there's no class. Your job is to make sure you are available anytime anybody needs anything. If you are not in your other classes, you are there at the guest house and you're just making yourself available for whatever they might need, right? And I was like, cool, sure, great. And so I did that. And I think, one, because of how young I was and I was new to, graduate school and new to everything, but I don't think I understood the profound impact that it would have on me, just being around all of these SNCC vets. And, it's in those times when you're not in class, when they're not, giving, because they did deliver a seminar to myself and my class, but it's those times when you're not in the seminar listening, right, to them deliver, right, this lecture or the seminar they've prepared. It's all those in between times when you're really like getting the connective tissue of the history. You're hearing the stories, and you are hearing the stories at times when perhaps when people are more relaxed, they're disarmed, there's no audience, right, and you are able to relate. And one thing that I've always tried to emphasize is that education, learning, teaching, it's always a relation first and foremost. It's not a transaction. It's not a, I'm giving information in return, you give me obedience. It's nothing like that. It is a relation. And because of that, you have to, establish a connection that's meaningful at the outset. And that's how I got involved, was being a volunteer on that day. And just, if someone wanted water, I would get them some water. I made some sandwiches. Whatever I could do to be helpful. And then Josh approached me a couple years back about getting involved again with the SNCC Legacy Project, because I believe Cortland had remembered my name from that time way back when. And I said, absolutely, yes. And here I am. And so the way that we kind of happened to, and I said, well, I also have a friend who would be great for this. Her name's Felicia. Let's get her in here as well. And so I think it helps that Josh and Felicia and I are already connected, right, in a way where we are each other's people in a way that has nothing to do with the institutions that we work for. And we have a deep attachment and investment in making sure that the history, right, of SNCC and of the broader Southern freedom struggles, right, are not only preserved, because how can you preserve anything perfectly, but disseminated while we are here and while we're available to be that link, right, between the SNCC vets and younger folks, or perhaps folks who might not be aware. And so that's how I got involved. And deciding the topics was a long process. I mean, we went back and forth. It was, as you can imagine, it was, well, I don't like this one. Well, I like this. Well, we should name the course this. Well, we should name it that. And eventually we had 4 courses, and one of the courses, Securing the Ballot, is the one that we're piloting this summer. And I'm just very excited to let people know that it's available. Yeah, and that this is a part of a broader education initiative from the SNCC Legacy Project. So,
yeah, that's great. Charlie, do you want to say more? You've talked about the practical matter. What would you do with these people? How would you organize a project like Freedom Summer? What would they do? The safety aspect, also the aspect of bringing the nation's children down to the South so that they were then, implicated directly, right, in what was going on down there, where it would have to care because now their children are there, right? Do you want to say more about the schools themselves? You've given a kind of idea that, of the places that they could be in terms of under a tree, in a church, in somebody's home, etc. But what was that experience like for you, being involved in that? And what were some of the things that are kind of memorable from that summer of doing that sort of project? I'm just interested in hearing you talk more about it from that kind of angle.
Well, the first thing I have to tell you is I wasn't teaching in schools. I was an organizer. I mean, so I had schools in my own project areas. Washington County, Issaquah County, Sharkey County. These names won't mean a lot to a lot of people. But I was directing a project of which the Freedom Schools were a part. I wasn't teaching, so my experience with the schools is not the same as a teacher's experience in the school. But for obvious reasons, I maintain a constant interest in the schools. And the first thing I remember is, one, the response to the idea of the schools from the community was much larger than we anticipated. We probably had, and I'm guesstimating here, maybe wound up with twice as many schools in Mississippi, and certainly in my own project area, than we had anticipated, because we had no way of knowing what the response would really be. The second thing I remember about schools is, and this completely surprised us, was the number of older people that wanted to be involved in that. I mean, our thinking was these schools we were setting up were really aimed at middle school and high school students. We did not anticipate people the ages of our parents and grandparents showing up and wanting to participate. Because remember, Mississippi, like most of the Black Belt South, had been deliberately kept illiterate and uneducated for decades. And the freedom schools to this generation of people, I'm talking about the people of my grandparents' age, these schools, from their point of view, represented an opportunity to gain access to something they had been denied. After all, the schools were shut down. Even when I was there, were shut down when it was time to plant the cotton. It was shut down when it was time to pick the cotton and whatnot. It was a system designed to keep Black people, really Black and white people, because if you went on to these plantations and you saw white sharecroppers on one side of the road and Black sharecroppers on the other side of the road, they were living exactly the same life, maybe $3 a day in so debt peonage. And it's all of that in the thinking of people was linked to being kept deliberately uneducated. So for them, they wanted to participate in this because it offered a route to a freer existence. And that's what I remember talking to people, older people, and hearing this over and over and over again from older, because my question would naturally be, well, why are you here? What brought you here to a program designed for young people? And it was clear, it became instantly clear that for older people, it was a route that had the possibility of leading to a freer existence. And I hadn't really thought about that beyond young people. I hadn't thought about it in terms of old. I did think in terms of older people, in terms of voter registration, yes, which young people couldn't do. But I hadn't thought about education in the sense of people my grandparents' age or my parents' age. It just hadn't occurred to me until I'm hearing these people say that. The other thing about the freedom schools that I remember is the explosion of creativity that erupted in these schools. Again, since I'm not a teacher, or certainly wasn't then a teacher by profession, I had no way to anticipate that. But these kids, not because we were teaching them this, almost immediately began using poetry as a way of creative expression. We didn't anticipate that. Yes, I understand you wanted to know about history. I understand, you wanting to develop writing skills and so on. But the explosion of poetry, which Julian Bond ultimately published some of these Freedom School poetry in a book, but it was noticeable once they found themselves in a space that didn't intimidate them for thinking, that didn't intimidate them for asking a question, particularly questions about the kind of life they were living in Mississippi. There was an explosion of creativity, and that stands out to me as one of the important aspects of the Freedom School experience. It gave real meaning, real heft to the phrase Freedom Schools. People were free to think, to ask a question, and then to express their own ideas without penalty and without punishment. And I don't know if people today understand how important that was in the middle 1960s. Although today we see a new assault on public education, certainly, and which is really an assault not just against Black education, but an assault on education.
Yeah, that's beautiful hearing you talk about that. And it reminds me of other examples throughout history of kind of in these revolutionary moments and things like that, of also what you're talking about, of this burst of creative energy, right? Kind of emancipatory, yeah, Bedour, did you want to add on to that?
No, actually, I think that's actually perfect.
That's
right
great.
there. Yes.
Well, what I wanted to ask a little bit is to kind of talk about today's context a little bit, and to also think about these contexts together, understanding that obviously there's a lot of difference. You all were engaged in a very specific struggle, in Mississippi and across the South. But I think about this past year and the organizing that has gone on college campuses against the sponsorship of the kind of genocidal war that we've seen in Gaza, and the vibrancy also of many kind of campus movements around trying to get their institutions to divest from this, other demands as well. Thinking about obviously the ways that the military and defense contractors and all of these things are very bound up with our educational institutions in the United States as well. And alongside that, we see not only the attack on Black studies and the attack on critical race theory, which we've been seeing for several years now and is continuing, but there's also in this moment increasingly just an attack on any kind of critical approach right now, any kind of, it's certainly on anyone that's teaching anti-Zionism, right, or teaching kind of pro-Palestinian or even, Palestinian history, right? A lot of times these things come across as just attacks on history, right? Of we don't want people to actually know the actual history of what the United States has done, what the state of Israel has done, how these things work together. And so it's interesting in this moment because I think we had all this energy on college campuses, and then obviously a lot of students went home for the summer, understandably, as we all knew that would occur. And I was thinking even towards the end of the year of, what are going to be the projects that help people continue to deepen their analysis, their education, and fortify people for further struggle, around a range of topics, right? We could talk about. So Bedour, do you want to say anything about that context? Because I know that obviously, you experience it from multiple angles of your world.
Yes, obviously I live and teach in Texas at the University of Texas, the biggest one of the biggest public universities in the country and the biggest university and college campus in the state of Texas. Also, being a Black person from the Middle East is also, it's tricky. And being inside of a Black studies department, sometimes I think to myself, well, isn't this just the best? Isn't this just what a time to be me in this particular place? And I say that on the one hand jokingly, but on the other hand, I also think what a time it is to be me in this place, because I do think that because of who I am on the one hand, but also because I'm connected to movement elders like Professor Cobb and Cortland Cox, that I might be uniquely positioned alongside some others, right, to intervene in the conversation in ways that can perhaps puncture, right, some of the more repetitious aspects, right, of perhaps how we're organizing, and also to break open, new conversations, or to perhaps just ask new questions, right, that might not have been tabled prior. And, it's interesting because I said this in a conversation with Josh last week, where I wrote a piece about the pendulum swing of Black liberation, right? And so we had all of this activity, right, on campuses. And now, yes, students have gone home, but a lot of students are tied up busy fighting charges right now, right, so that they can return to campuses as well. That's taking up a lot of energy of these students who, were organizing. They want to come back and keep organizing. And so they're busy fighting charges at the university level, and also at the criminal legal level as well, so they can continue doing that. So there's that. But there's also part of the difficulty, right, in a place like Texas, and increasingly, well, now pretty much across the entire country, right, is the idea that allowing, right, fascist ideas to circulate, homophobic, racist, etc. ideas to circulate, that it means allowing for, different intellectual perspectives and positions, right? And what people don't understand is that fascist ideas, that homophobia, racism, these are not intellectual perspectives at all, right? They're quite the opposite of intellectual perspectives. And that's the kind of sleight of hand that seems to be hardest for people to demystify, right? The idea that colleges are meant to be intellectually diverse. There is nothing intellectual about racism or sexism, homophobia, or subscribing to fascist ideas, right? And so you're in a college environment, right, where these ideas are picking up speed, and you are being forced to consider them as if they were intellectual contributions, when they're the opposite. They kill, right, intellectual growth, and they are deeply anti-intellectual, right? So there's that. But then, right, I think there is a way that working with college students, one thing I tried to communicate to them as much as I possibly could, right, was that, the issues you're organizing around, and even some of the way you're organizing, is not new, right? Nothing under the sun is new. And, Jay, I've been on your podcast before to talk about my book, but this idea, right, that there is a repetition, but there's always a repetition with a twist, right? The issue and the desire to organize and the pendulum swinging back in the direction of liberation is not new, but the historical moment is new, right? So it's always a kind of repetition with a twist. And I tried to communicate to them, guys, you're not the only college students organizing around Palestine, right? I said, if you look, SNCC issued a statement in 1967, right, in support of Palestine. And I even showed them this statement, and part of the statement highlighted two things. Highlighted, one, the uncritical support given to the state of Israel, but two, the suppression of American Jewish voices in America that are critical of Israel, right?
Yeah.
But they wouldn't, for some reason, they wouldn't assume, right, to go to the SNCC archives to find that particular critique, right, which is not only dovetails with exactly what they want to do, but it isn't an exact echo, right? I'm like, is there an echo in the room? Because I've heard this before, and I can show you, right, where I've heard it, right? And then there's also the fact that a lot of conversations around what does it mean, right, for Black people to organize around Palestine, and being a Black person from the Middle East, that's always been a strange question, because I'm like, well, why not? But, right, you look at as well, right, the Sixth Pan-African Congress, right, SNCC members like like Professor Cobb, like Cortland Cox, instrumental in, one, the idea that it should be held on the African continent, right? But one of the main resolutions at Six-Pack was Palestine, right? And so, and also, Mae Mallory was part of, the former political prisoner, Mae Mallory is also part of organizing it, right? So there was, to ask that question betrays an assumption that that isn't already the case, and that hasn't always already been the case, right? That Black people have been organizing globally against, right, all forms, right, of colonial domination, right? And I think, to tie it back to the Freedom Schools, I think one thing that the Freedom School manifesto or declaration or proposal emphasizes, right, is not that and this is something that I think is crucial in this moment, right, is that we're not just moving against a particular government, right? We are moving against a system in general, right? A system that has always been moving against us, right? And to do that, you need a complete project, right? I said this before in another podcast, but I don't think Fanon wasn't mincing words when he said you either liberate the whole of the society or you don't, right? You have to account for every part of a society, right? And this is something that SNCC understood, right? With the Freedom Schools, Drum and Spear bookstore, they had theaters, right? Theater training and workshops and theaters where people could create art, right? To express what they were feeling, right? They had, of course, studied and deep and technical political organizing as well, organized around the vote, which is not the same, right, as, building a monument or a tower or cathedral to the idea of electoral politics altogether. So it's not the same thing, but organizing around the vote, right? And I think that is the message, right, that I want to communicate more than anything else, is that we are not simply organizing against the potential candidate or a potential candidate that we don't want or do want. We are moving against a system. And in order to do that, you have to push back in a way that is much more broad, much more profound, and much more durable. And to do that, you have to study. There's no other way around it, And I think that's the thing that I would hope to communicate as much as possible in the support that I've been offering to students who have been doing amazing, even without me. I mean, they don't really, but where I can, this is the message that I try to emphasize.
I appreciate that. Professor Cobb, one of the things this makes me think about is that you and many folks from SNCC ultimately at some point made a decision that you were going to put college on hold, right? Like a lot of you were students in the beginning, probably almost all of you were students in the beginning. The name is in the name, right? But then, you get down in Mississippi, in Alabama, in these places, and you're organizing. And at some point, there's a decision made for a lot of you that this is what you're called to do at this time. And yet, I think it's also an important aspect of the story that, like you and many others, eventually you do go back to school. You became a professor, right? And so there's also I want that message to young people a little bit, because I'd also want people to understand that if you're so called to organize, and like sometimes the college campus may be the spot to do that. And you should certainly think about that, but also, I don't want people to also think that it's the only place or the only way to approach organizing as well. And so maybe you could just share a little bit about that story for you and some of your comrades, if you can, kind of extrapolate out a little bit how they thought about that.
Well, arguably, the most influential adult within SNCC was Ella Baker. Among the many messages or lessons, I'm not sure how to characterize this, she put before us was, think about how you want to live your life. And you live life, I think, in stages. So, I mean, if you take me, one stage in my life was my involvement with the sit-in movement. as a Howard University student. And most of us in SNCC came out of the sit-in movement. Another stage in life was my involvement in organizing in Mississippi. Now, I had no intention of not going back to school and staying in Mississippi, as it turned out, for almost 5 years. I had gotten off a bus. I will spare you the whole story. I talk about it in my last book. This nonviolent stuff will get you killed. But basically, I got off a bus on the way to a conference to introduce myself to Mississippi students who were sitting in, and they challenged me. And I think an important lesson to understand about the movement is that as much as it's involved struggle against white supremacy and racism and segregation and all of that, perhaps more importantly to understanding the movement is the fact that it also involved challenges that Black people made to one another within the Black community. I got off this bus, introduced myself to the sit-in students who immediately challenged me. You're going to a conference to chatter about civil rights? What's the point of doing that? You're standing right here in Mississippi. We're getting ready to do stuff here. And I did. I said, oh, you're right. And I'm really compressing a more complex story. And I went up into the Mississippi, dealt with him. It was summertime. I didn't have to be in classes. School didn't start until the fall and whatnot. And what I didn't realize was that I couldn't at the end of the summer then say, well, folks, it's been interesting, but I've got to register for classes. And I wound up staying with them. What it was intended to be a summer involvement became a 5-year involvement with SNCC in Mississippi. And I think a lot of people in SNCC have that kind of story. So do, interestingly enough, a lot of people in the movement for Black Lives today. I mean, I'm working on a book about them now, and I've talked to them about how they became involved full-time in this movement. And a lot of the stories resonate with my own story. So you live life, I think, in stages, but they're all connected to one another. You can't segregate or separate my involvement in the sit-in movement in 1960 and 61 from my involvement with SNCC as an organizer between 1962 and 1967, or my involvement with SNCC in 1960, after 1967, my involvement with SNCC from my involvement with Africa later on. First, just as somebody curious about Africa, because that's how we got Drum and Spear started. A simple wandering into the Présence Africaine bookstore in Paris and being engaged by Africans who were interested in me because I was involved in the civil rights movement. So there's a whole process, but I always root it as beginning with Ella Baker, because she's the one who really is telling us, think for yourself. Think about the kind of life you want to live and how you want to get there. So a lot of the SNCC process, aside from the grassroots community organizing, was part of the SNCC process, and an important part of it was us thinking about the kind of life we wanted and how you get that. And that doesn't happen all at once. I mean, because as you go along, you learn stuff. You know, what I learned from Mrs. Hamer in 1962, what I learned from African liberation fighters in 1970, what I learned from all of that is part of the process, certainly is a part of my process. And even now, as an 81-year-old, I'm learning stuff from the movement for Black Lives people or the Black Lives Matter people. who are millennials and Generation X people. So that's life. And as I say, I was lucky that I came under the influence of someone like Miss Baker, who made her way to us when she was 57 years old. She was older than my mother. and she made her way to us, then, and began to talk to us and cultivate us, I think, because she had an idea in her head about what we should be. And I don't apologize for coming under her influence, and appreciate greatly having come under her influence. That's the sort of the short answer to your question, because I could take the whole afternoon talking about this.
I'll ask a quick kind of follow-up to something that you mentioned earlier on. And my copy of this Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed is here, but I lost the cover a while ago, which is why it's not on the shelf behind me. But you talked about, and people can go listen to the conversation we had with you a couple of years ago, where you go into it maybe at a little bit more length. But I would love for you to just take a moment and just talk a little bit about how communities in Mississippi were self-organized when you got there, and particularly around this idea of defense, right? Because of how violent Mississippi was, how dangerous it was. You talked about, the danger of driving one side of the county to another with white people in the car with you and stuff like that. And so could you just say a little bit? I know that you go in, I encourage people to read your book if they haven't, because you go into it in much more detail there. And then you could check out our podcast if you want some too. But yeah, just give folks a thumbnail sketch, if you will, of that. There it is. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm always happy to see my book flash.
Everybody buy this book. It's fantastic. Okay, sorry, Professor Cobb.
No, apologies are necessary. Look, self-defense goes way back. It's like education. There's a whole tradition that goes all the way back to the days of slavery. Self-defense, stand your ground, with the possible exception of Native Americans, who also stood their ground. Stand your ground is rooted in the Black communities. Enslaved people in revolt, plotting, and the like. So, and what I talk about in the book is some of that history, which we don't have time to talk about now. But clearly, when I describe our experience, meaning the experience particularly of SNCC and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality organizers, in the Deep South, is in these communities, you found deep wells of strength. And you found that, and remember, I'm coming from Washington, D.C. To Mississippi. And so my whole image of Mississippi is submissive, Blacks oppressed into silence, symbolized by the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. And what you find are these deep wells of strength in these rural communities that you knew nothing about, because they're not covered by the newspapers, they're not covered in television. And that part of that strength had to do with how people defended themselves. It's as simple as that. And the best way to understand that, I tell people all the time, is all you have to do is understand Black people as human beings. And when it comes to terrorism, they're going to act the way any human being will act. Do the best they can to defend themselves and their families and their communities. And if you were a SNCC organizer or a CORE organizer working in these counties, people saw you as one of their children. And they were going to respond to you when you were in danger the way anybody in that community would respond to one of their children being in danger. Now, they weren't always successful, as the story of James Chaney and Mickey Schwerner and Andy Goodman show, or lots of people I could name that, just in my experience, Herbert Lee, who were assassinated and killed, Medgar Evers, or Martin Luther King for that matter. They weren't always successful, but that was their instinct, their attitude. And I'm trying to tell a story about who these people are. When Hartman Turnbull, one of the people I portray in the book, drove the Night Riders away from his farmhouse in Holmes County, Mississippi, when we came up that following morning, the first thing out of Mr. Turnbull's mouth, and he was a man older than my father, first thing out of his mouth was, I wasn't being nonviolent, I was just protecting my family. Once you understand that, then you can get a hold of the whole thing that's going on with respect to guns and self-defense. We're not talking about guerrilla warfare here. We're not talking about, you're not in some cowboy movie where the good guys are at one end of the street and the bad guys are at the other end of the street. And you go for your pistols and whoever is fastest wins. No, we're not talking about stuff like that. We're talking about how human beings, ordinary human beings, live and what they decide to do. When the Night Riders attacked the home of a family I was staying with in Ruleville, Mississippi, in Sunflower County, his response was to grab his wife and jump into the iron bathtub so that he would be protected from. So people respond in lots of different kinds of ways. But the thing to understand about them, and the thing to understand about the movement, is we're talking about human beings. And if you want to understand their response, then you have to think of how they respond as human responses. And if you get that fixed in your mind, then you understand everything.
That's beautiful. I think that's a great place to kind of start to wind down. I do want to respect both of your time today. I do, just in closing, Bedour, is there anything else that you want to say about the project that you're about to start tomorrow that people can sign up for, and some of what you all want to bring out in this project this summer?
Yes, absolutely. So registration is still open. You can still register. It's 3 weeks, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday evenings, from 6 to 7:30. There is an in-person option for those who are in New York and a virtual option for those who are not in New York. The course is absolutely free. There is no cost to participate. And once you register, you'll receive an invitation email and a welcome email with all of the course materials as well. So there's no need to purchase any course materials, because the course is being taught entirely using the database of documents from the SNCC Digital Gateway, as well as some other books that have also been made available via the SNCC Digital Gateway. So we're really excited and happy that we're able to do this in a way that is actually free, right? We're not selling you anything. You have to subscribe to anything I'm doing, in return for showing up to this. This is entirely for those who want it and who feel like they could use it. And, one thing that I really love about this project that we're working on is this is essentially a pilot, right, for a collection of syllabi that we've been building out for the SNCC Legacy Project's education component. And the hope, right, is that with this pilot, we'll get feedback, right, on how to kind of adjust the syllabi so that when we do make them available, they're more suited to what people need and require for themselves and their communities. And I'm really proud of the way we've done this, because one thing that we have done already with the drafts that we've prepared is offer extensive teaching notes for a variety of situations. So if it's a college classroom, a high school, community group, in a church, where have you, flipped classroom, seminar style lecture, we offer extensive teaching notes just for those who feel like, what, maybe I can't teach that. Anybody can teach this class if they have the materials, right? All you need is a group of people who are willing, and we will take care of the rest. And that's kind of the approach that we've been taking. It's taken a lot of work. So I hope you all come out and join. And I also just want to emphasize something that Professor Cobb said earlier, about the importance of education, because education is one of the few things that one person, right, can go into a pedagogical setting, learn and study. And it is one of the very few things where the effect of that one person doing that is immense, right? Throughout it can either benefit the whole of society or it can not benefit the whole of society. One person, right, going and studying something, or a group of people going. Education is one of the few things that has such an immediate and profound and widespread impact on the whole of society, for better or for worse. And so it is the name of the game. And, I think about Julian Bond, in the introduction to Angela Davis's book, When They Come for Us. And he talks about how we're inside of this domestic struggle against colonialism, right? So he takes Kwame Ture's thesis and he says, we are still active inside of this domestic struggle against colonialism. And his question is, where is the defense committee for the unnamed? He says, where are the millions to march for freedom for those who can never march except in lockstep again? And he says, they could come from the readers of this book. Read, remember, learn, and act, right? This is exactly what he says in the foreword to that book. And I think read, remember, learn, act is the name of the game. And we're hoping that folks can gather some tools that they might need to sturdy themselves against what might and possibly will be a very difficult year, comparatively speaking. And so I'm just really happy that I get to do it.
Well, I'm grateful that you all are. I've had all of you on the podcast individually over the years and have a lot of respect for you all as educators, as thinkers. And so I'm sure it will be a great opportunity for people. And yeah, I just want to thank you both, Professor Cobb, Professor Alagraa, for this conversation. It's been great to be in conversation again with you both again, and have immense appreciation for both of you.
Thank you,
Thank
Jane.
you.
Thank you.
you.